There are certain things that only things that are alive do that distinguish them from non-living things. And there are certain conditions that must be met to be able to sustain these processes of life. The purpose of this web lecture is first to review from your reading what conditions were necessary on Earth before life could emerge, but also to start to teach you the skill of building concept maps. So in this web lecture, we're going to basically be reviewing content, so I'm not going to be giving a great deal of explanation of the content, that's all in your book, but I'm going to be helping you to see how to organize it so that you can see the connections between different facts that you've read about. The best way to use this web lecture is to follow along just exactly the way you would in class, taking careful notes, and also following along with building this concept map as I do it and taking advantage of the activities that I suggest along the way. Just to remind you, these things that organisms that are alive do, that things that are non-living do not do, is first of all to maintain an internal environment that's different from the external environment, and we call this ability homeostasis. The second thing is gathering, transforming, and using energy from the environment, and we call this metabolism, and this is the energy source that drives everything else that the cell or the organism does. Another thing that living things do is make copies of themselves. Okay, reproduction. So we're able to reproduce and pass our genetic material on to future generations. And fourth of all, things that are alive are going to increase in biomass. And this is going to also involve the use of energy and transformation of energy. So now let's think about what structures or processes would need to be in place for living things to do all of those functions that we just saw on the last slide. So first of all, if you're going to maintain an internal environment that's distinct from an external environment, you need to have some kind of boundary between the two. And in the case of cells, this would be in the form of a cell membrane, which is semi-permeable. So the structure of the cell membrane, for those of you who have not taken Gen Bio 1, is that it consists of two layers of a kind of molecule called phospholipids. So phospholipids have one side, these little ball-like structures that are water attracting. And so you'll see those both on the surface of the cell that is exposed to the environment, and also the surface of the membrane that's exposed to the interior of the cell. All right, so these are both the parts that are exposed to the aqueous environment, both outside and inside the cell. So these are the water attracting parts. And sandwiched in between them are these water repelling tails. So these are the lipid parts of the phospholipid molecules. So what that means is that molecules that are soluble in water can't get through this middle part because it is water repelling. And molecules that are soluble fats can't get through this part of the membrane that is water loving or water attracting. So this is an effective barrier to many, many, many kinds of molecules, and the only way for these molecules to get into or out of the cell is through these transport proteins that can be regulated by the processes in the cell. So this is a very effective semi-permeable membrane that the living thing can actually control what materials get in and out of the cell. Second, metabolism requires chemical reactions, and these are usually catalyzed by enzymes, and they mostly occur in aqueous solution. So a liquid water environment is critical to having these metabolic processes occur. Also, most of these biochemical reactions occur in a very narrow range of acid, so in a narrow range of pH. So the environment can't be too acidic nor too basic. And so this, for those of you who have taken Gen Bio 1, is the very familiar Krebs cycle. For those who have not taken Gen Bio 1, don't worry about this for right now, but this is a diagram of the chemical reactions that take place to metabolize glucose. Reproduction requires organic molecules that are able to make copies of themselves, and for most living things, this is DNA. Again, for those of you who've not taken Gen Bio 1, don't worry about the details of this, but it requires nucleic acids, which are the actual genetic material, either RNA or DNA, plus enzymes that catalyze all of the reactions that allow duplication of these molecules. And finally, growth requires the use of energy to store organic compounds and increase biomass. And you don't have to have taken Gen Bio 1 to know that this is just downright adorable, and this is what's necessary to turn a puppy into an adult dog. Now that we know a little bit more about the conditions that would have been necessary for the critical processes for life, now we can start to construct our concept map to see how the Earth gradually became a hospitable place to support life. So we've seen already this idea of different phases of the atmosphere of Earth. So atmosphere number 1, which was composed primarily of hydrogen and helium, gradually giving off those atoms to space and ending up eventually with atmosphere number 2, composed primarily of water vapor, carbon dioxide, and ammonia. The first thing we always do when we begin to construct a concept map is to try to take all of the ideas that we just read about and condense them down into one central idea. What was all of this reading about? So in this case, the case of the reading that you did for Prep 1, it's all about the conditions for life on Earth. So we're going to put that in the center of our concept map, and everything is going to sort of revolve around this one central idea. So when we have our atmosphere number 2, what we're starting to find is that the temperature on Earth is starting to become lower. It's starting to become more moderate. So remember that in the beginnings of the Earth, the temperature was extremely high. It was a very, very hot environment. And we know that we need liquid water to be able to support these chemical reactions that occur in aqueous solutions. They cannot occur without the presence of water. So obviously, one of the critical factors in producing liquid water is the moderate temperatures. We know that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, and so we need to have temperatures lower than 100 degrees Celsius to be able to have liquid water. So we're representing that in our concept map with an arrow, and the direction of the arrow indicates the direction of causality. So the lower temperatures cause an increase in the amount of liquid water, and we can see lower temperatures mean more water is in the liquid form rather than the gas form, and so we've got a direction of cause and effect, and the arrow represents that. But why do we start to get lower temperatures? Well, one thing that we saw in the book is that early on in Earth's history, it was constantly being just bombarded by rocks from space, okay? These asteroids were coming and hitting the Earth, causing the temperature to remain high. But also, from its beginnings as this sort of molten ball of rock, it's just going to be giving off radiant heat, and it just needs time to cool down. So once it stopped being bombarded by these asteroids and had time to cool down, then we start to see these temperatures decreasing. So once the temperatures decrease, then we can get liquid water. So again, we've got an arrow indicating the direction of causality. Time and not getting hit by rocks leads to moderate temperature, which then in turn leads to an increase in the liquid water. Another factor that's really important in making the Earth a hospitable place for life is a reduction in the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Okay, again, so once carbon dioxide mixes with water, it creates a very acidic environment. So we really needed a reduction in that atmospheric carbon dioxide to be able to create a pH that's optimal for these chemical reactions to occur. So at this point, I'm going to review what you read in the book about how these carbon dioxide levels became reduced in the atmosphere. And what I'd like you to do is, while I am talking about this, take very careful notes and be really, really thinking consciously about this idea of cause and effect. If you were going to map out these causes and effects, where would you put the arrows? What direction would they go? What causes what? Let me first bring your attention to this figure from your book. So this is what we call a double Y graph. So on the x-axis we have time in the number of years after the Earth formed, and we can see that this is a logarithmic scale. It goes by powers of 10 rather than in even increments. And we have two different y-axes. So one of the things that's plotted is temperature, and so we see this on the left-hand y-axis in degrees Celsius, and on the right-hand y-axis we see amount of gas or liquid. So this is going to apply both to this line that represents the amount of water in the gaseous state, but then in the liquid state, once we get to that, and the amount of carbon dioxide are both going to be plotted with reference to the scale on the right-hand axis. So what this graph really shows is how tightly connected these three factors are: the surface temperature of the Earth, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the amount of liquid water there is present. So as we can see, as the surface temperature starts to decrease, once we get to a temperature of 100 degrees Celsius, this is the boiling point of water, then we start to have liquid water. Along with that, we see a dramatic decrease in the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide. So this is falling very precipitously. And as the level of carbon dioxide begins to fall, we start to see that the surface temperature is going to be falling even further, until eventually the surface temperature stabilizes, the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide stabilizes, and we have the stable liquid oceans. So let's take a look at what really drives this part of the graph, where we get the decrease in carbon dioxide and the decrease in temperature sort of falling rapidly together. So this is also a figure from your book, and we're just going to walk through this process step by step. And again, please take careful notes on all of these causes and effects. So we start with high levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. When the temperature is low enough to form liquid water, what we get is basically clouds. So what are clouds? They're droplets of liquid water that are suspended in the air because of condensation. So they're going to condense when the temperature reaches a low enough level. And when the carbon dioxide interacts with this liquid water up in the atmosphere, in the sky, these clouds, it forms carbonic acid. So this is the chemical reaction for those of you who have taken chemistry. For those of you who haven't, I do not want you to memorize these chemical reactions, but just know that it forms carbonic acid and then it rains down. And the rain is basically acid rain. This is exactly what we talk about when we talk about acid rain. So this water that comes down into the mountains is acidic. So that acid reacts with the rocks in the mountains, and it actually dissolves the rocks a little bit. So what you have in this water that's running down in the form of rivers is the dissolved calcium from the rocks and carbonate ions that also form from the breakdown of the rocks interacting with this carbonic acid. So these materials are going to be carried by rivers down to the ocean. In the ocean, the calcium and bicarbonate precipitate, so they come together to form calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is basically limestone. It actually becomes the part of the ocean floor. So basically this carbon becomes sequestered as calcium carbonate, and it's no longer available to be carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's not going to be released back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. It is stored more or less permanently in the ocean floor. So we call this sequestration. The carbon has been sequestered in the ocean floor in the form of calcium carbonate. So now, at this point, what I'd like you to do is pause this video and take a stab at filling in part of this concept map on your own with the information that I just gave you about this carbon cycle. So you have the image to look at when the video is paused, and use those arrows to show the causes and effects of how this carbon becomes sequestered out of the atmosphere and stored more or less permanently, or at least for very, very long periods of time, on the ocean floor. Okay, pause now. Welcome back. So now let's continue with filling in this concept map. And so I'm going to show you how I put together this information to summarize it. If yours looks a little bit different, that's fine. Everybody's got their own way of organizing it. What I'm showing you is just a suggestion for one way. So the first thing that was really important in what we said was the presence of liquid water. The presence of liquid water drives all of this. And so what does the liquid water do? Because there's water present, that allows the atmospheric carbon dioxide to combine with the liquid water to form carbonic acid. This carbonic acid falls down to the earth in the form of acid rain. So this is that chemical reaction that forms a carbonic acid. And when it hits the mountains and the rock, it reacts with the rock and forms bicarbonate and calcium. Then those carbonate and calcium ions are then carried by rivers to the ocean. Once it's in the ocean, it precipitates to form calcium carbonate. So now this carbon is sequestered in the ocean, and that is what leads to the reduction of these carbon dioxide levels. So again, if the chemical equation is helpful to you, keep it in your map. If it's not, then don't. And again, these reduced carbon dioxide levels are critical for the conditions for life on Earth. But there's one more thing that this reduced carbon dioxide does, and that has to do also with the surface temperature of the Earth. So you might have heard of carbon dioxide as something called a greenhouse gas. So when there's a lot of it, it traps a lot of heat in the atmosphere. When there's not so much of it, it lets that heat be released out into space. And so that will further decrease the temperature on the Earth. So now what we have is this feedback loop where the moderate temperature leads to more liquid water that goes through this whole process that reduces carbon dioxide, and that comes back and lowers the temperature even more, resulting in even more liquid water. And this loop continues until some sort of stable equilibrium is reached. And that's exactly what you saw in that graph I showed you a while ago with these rapidly changing conditions once this process comes into motion. So for this part of the concept map, I explained in quite a bit of detail these processes. For the rest of this, I'm going to focus more just on how to organize the ideas that you've read. Formation of organic molecules is extremely important to all of these processes of life, from reproduction to metabolism to homeostasis. So that's a critical condition for life on Earth. And so let's start to think about how that might have happened. You read in your book about the possibility of a reducing atmosphere on Earth giving rise spontaneously to organic molecules. And these molecules that were in the atmosphere contain all of the necessary atoms that would need to come together to form organic molecules if they're exposed to an energy source that can cause them to assemble in the right way. And as far as evidence for that, you read about the Miller-Urey experiment, and the most important point to remember about that is what that experiment showed was that it's at least possible under some conditions that may have been like the early conditions on Earth. It's possible for organic molecules to be spontaneously assembled from inorganic precursors. Another possibility that you read about in your book was that these organic molecules might have had an extraterrestrial origin, come from space, and the evidence that they provided for that was that organic molecules have been found in meteorites. Another thing that is necessary for the beginnings of life is for these organic molecules to interact to form these metabolic pathways. And so, of course, before you can have metabolic pathways, you need to have organic molecules to participate in them, but these metabolic pathways are one of the essential components of life. And so, without getting too much into the biochemistry, especially for those of you who haven't taken Bio 1, one possibility that was presented by the book is that these early reproducing organisms were able to build organic molecules from inorganic compounds, and we call that being autotrophic. And that if there was formaldehyde in that early atmosphere, that could have been reassembled into glucose. But to be able to get energy from glucose, a process called glycolysis would be necessary. Again, if you haven't taken Bio 1, don't worry about this, but just know that this is the series of chemical reactions that leads to converting glucose into energy. But you need enzymes for that, and enzymes are relatively complicated molecules that probably wouldn't have been the first ones to spontaneously self-assemble. These early metabolic reactions might have been catalyzed by simple RNA molecules, which could have been used as enzymes before there were amino acids. And then this would be the earliest form of a simple metabolic pathway, forming glucose from formaldehyde in an autotrophic organism, and then using these simple RNA molecules to catalyze the reaction of glycolysis to produce energy. The other critical component is, remember, something that was very important to this idea of homeostasis, and that's having a cell membrane to separate the living thing from the external environment. This is also going to be really important for separating these metabolic reactions from the outside environment. And what was needed was organic molecules to participate in forming the cell membrane. And some of the simplest molecules that could have done that could have been formed spontaneously, would be fatty acids. So these are similar in structure to these phospholipids that I showed you earlier. They have hydrophobic heads and hydrophilic tails. So again, they've got these water-attracting and water-repelling regions that can form that bilayer that creates a semi-permeable membrane. So this, now that it's finished, is a very, very complicated diagram, but it basically has all of the information that you read in your textbook summarized in a form that you can see all of the interactions between all of the different components of the reading that you did. So this is a very nice way to summarize a lot of different ideas that seem to be these unrelated kind of facts to memorize, but really they're part of a much, much bigger picture. So again, yours may not look exactly like mine. Use whatever you need to be able to make this diagram make sense to you. You might want to write some things along these arrows to remind you why, for example, liquid water is essential for this phase, what this causation is all about, putting in different notes to help you remember some of the details. But this really gives you the big picture and the ability to see how all of these ideas are connected to each other. Looking ahead, we've seen now how the Earth's atmosphere had to be transformed before life could arise. And what we're going to start to see over the next couple weeks is how the presence of life itself actually transformed the Earth and the atmosphere, particularly when we start to see organisms that are capable of photosynthesis adding oxygen to the atmosphere, and that changes everything.